Whether it's in a relationship or sometimes it's your family members, sometimes it's your friends, and they want to see what you're doing for a living, and they want to see whether or not you actually like your job. Because, for example, when you're with your family members, it's just really expected to talk about where you work and if you really like your work. And if you're not working, they're always going to be on you to see if you're going to get a job. Basically, with your family members, it's a conversation that you can't really avoid. They always want to see where you're working. They want to see if you're actually applying for jobs if you're not working. You have to realize that with your friends, it's also the people that you really work with, because you're trying to make connections through that way. With your friends, you may have actually grown up with them, but then you realize that you start to grow apart as you start to have your own lives. When it comes to your friends, you need to know who you're going to be friends with in the moment and who you're going to be friends with in the future. Because you realize that some conversations are very transactional. Some people will say that you need to do this for me and then I'll do this for you. And some people don't do things unless they have things in return. You realize that for the most part, if you're not relocating to another area, you're spending time with the people that you're working with the most. And when you're spending time with the people that you're working with the most, you have to at least like them, and you need to love your job. Because you realize that the conversations that you do have, what are you actually talking about? And is your conversations about what you're doing all the time? Because if your conversations are about what you like to do and what you do all the time, you realize that you're not really learning anything from that conversation. And it's always what you're doing, but then other people, they aren't really doing anything themselves. Or sometimes people, they just work in their job and that's all they really talk about. And you need to realize as well that when you are in a job, that's why I said this thing earlier, because some people are going to ask you, what do you do for a living? And it's just a question that you need to expect, because so many people are going to ask that question. For anyone that's watching this, I have a question to really ask you. So, for example, when you had your first job, you need to realize, how did you get that job in the first place? Because let's say you have no experience and then all of a sudden you got a job out of nowhere. You know how you build up experience in your career and you have similar jobs that you've worked at, but it's many different companies. Basically when you're starting off in a clean slate and you have no experience, you're more likely to get a job when you have no experience than when you build up your career and then you want to start something new. And I want to know, why is that so much harder to do that? So basically, I'm going to break this video down in terms of the people that you meet, how much you're getting paid, but then also I'm going to break it down in terms of how far you're traveling to the work that you go to. So I'm going to start off with the people that you meet, and I did briefly talk about this because for example when you're meeting so many people, you're going to spend so much time at your job. And I'm going to say this, which is very important when it comes to job dissatisfaction. So I'm going to say that again. You're spending more time with people in your work than you do outside your work. So that's why when you don't like someone at your work, because you realize that you can't really say too much about it because you're in that environment and you can't really control it. And they can control it to an extent where you can work different times, but at the same time, you are going to bump into that person again that you don't like. I'm going to say this, it is okay to work with someone that you don't like, but you agree on certain things. So for example, when you're working with someone that you don't like and you disagree on certain things, so you might be working really fast, they're always looking into details about the ways that you can improve your work. They just assume that they're good, but then they're always looking at things that you can improve, and they're always giving you advice that you didn't really ask for. But I do understand that it's very important to be open-minded. But that's why when it comes to people that you don't like, you need to make sure that you agree on things. So you agree that you're going to work together, but then you also agree on who's doing what. You have to realize that if you complain, that people are going to look at you a certain way. And if you're not involved in the conversations in a group, you're basically the odd one out. It's basically an unspoken rule that if you're in a job and everyone else is in a group, that you have to just join them. What I'm going to say as my second point, you have to realize that conversations are very transactional, where people won't do things for you unless you're doing things that benefit them. So for example, let's say you're covering a shift for someone else. Because you're covering a shift for someone else, you expect that person to cover your shift another day. And if they don't follow through with it, basically they get in trouble, but so do you. So it's going back to my point earlier that you're spending most of your time with people at work. And if your conversations are basically all about work, you realize that it can be socially draining. Like, obviously you are helping the company perform better, but it's very socially draining because you're basically talking about things that you might not have passion in. But then this is why it's so important to really love your job, because if people are going to talk about work all the time, you need to be proud of your job and to be proud of the things that you do. So you know, when you're always doing a good job at work, sometimes it's just really expected because you're always doing a good job, and people won't always congratulate you all the time. But what I'm going to say about that is because you need to start celebrating the small wins. Not everyone is going to celebrate all your achievements with you. Sometimes you have to just celebrate your small wins by yourself. And I do understand that people are busy, and some people have to work because they have to and not because they want to. So the last thing that I'm going to say before I move on to pay, you know, for example, when people say, what do you do for a living? And you know, when you're on your break at work, and sometimes when you are outside of work, because you love your job, you start to learn about your job outside of work so that you can perform better. And the feedback that people give you of how to perform better, you start to take that into consideration so that you're not making the same mistakes. Here is what I'm going to say. You know, when you're on your break and you're no longer at work, you start to think about your work all the time, because you're thinking about how the next day that you're going to sleep early so that you can wake up early to go to work. And that's what I'm going to say, because you're spending most of your time to work. And then you realize as well that all you're doing is really thinking about work. Sometimes when you're thinking about work, you start to get stressed out because you're trying to perform the best, you're trying to be the best, and you're trying to keep up with your appearance so that you look professional, you look put together, and you want to give people the impression that you have everything figured out. And the thing is, work does give you some direction, but you have to realize as well that if you don't really love the thing that you're doing, people can see that over time. I think I've been there at one point, but it could be the same thing for you. You know, for example, why I talk about this so much is because it's very important to not neglect your health. And it's very important that, you know, when you are going to work, that you're not stressed out. And even if you are stressed, to manage your stress and to actually talk about it. Because it's better to address it and to ask people that can actually help you. And another thing that I'm going to say, you need to start taking advice from people that have worked there longer than you so that you can perform better. Because where you are now is where people that have worked for a long time used to be. They managed to adapt and they managed to find a way of how to do things that work for them and how to manage your time so that you can accomplish so much in a short amount of time, or you start to build up small wins over time. I've been here for like 20 minutes, so I'm going to move on to pay now. You know, for example, while you are in a job, you know what is required of the role, so you do what you can to do everything for the role. But then some companies, they don't pay you on time, or sometimes the pay is not really what you expected. And some people are motivated to work in a company based on how much they pay. But let me just ask you this question. For example, company A pays more than company B. People start to treat you better in company B. So when it comes to company A, it's based on hierarchy and it's based on status. But when it comes to company B, people treat you better. And what I'm going to say is that some people are willing to work in a company that doesn't treat them better, but they pay more. So the main takeaway of this video is just to be aware of when you're dissatisfied in a job. And I'm not going to tell you to leave your job, but I just want you to be aware that it's important to really address the issues that you have with your job so that the dissatisfaction doesn't increase.